Okay, hi everyone, this is SmithyQ, SmithyQ.com, and I'm back here with another video analysis. This one was requested on the chess.com forums. There's a user, Losing and Learning 81, posted a game, played against a computer, and asked specifically about some help in the endgame. What can we do? How can we improve? And we're going to take a look. Of course, I will say right now, up front, that the endgame is probably my weakest stage. It's probably everyone's weakest stage. But I think there's quite a bit we can learn from here, even if it's just a superficial analysis, if you will. I might not go, into the nitty-gritty weeds, so to speak, but I think if we look at the overall thought process or how we should approach some of these positions, I think it could really help. So if we look at this position, he was white, and if we just look at it right now, white is doing absolutely fantastic. He's up a pawn. Black's king is misplaced. White's queen is it's right here. It's perfect. Notice how it's pressuring this rook. So that means if the black queen were ever to leave the back rank, for example, if it tried to take the pawn, well, the rook is hanging. And so that means the black queen has to stay on the back rank. And that makes it hard to get this rook into the game. It's also hard to get this rook into the game because black can't castle. Maybe he can do something with rook h6. Maybe that kind of looks artificial. If you look at white, by contrast, again, the queen is great. The knight can jump to d5, or it can jump, a4, c5. These are all great. e4, or the knight can go pretty much anywhere it wants, and everything is targeting a weakness, either the black king or some of these weak squares. The rook can come all the way down here to d7. That'd be great. But the one thing we have to watch out for, though, is, again, our king is still in the center. And if white can castle here, I think black is just in for a world of hurt. We can play rook e1. All of our pieces are in the game. Black's pieces are struggling. Again, we don't have to worry about the pawn. We're just going to win that way. And even if that didn't work, even if there was no tactic, material is still equal, but white's pieces are far superior. And this would be a dream position. And so I think the main thing we want to look at, there's a lot of arrows here, I'll go back one square, is that this is a position where we don't actually want to go into the endgame, at least not right away. It's true, when you're up material, simplifying into the endgame would be great. But here, we have an excellent middle game position. And so one thing, what might have happened is sometimes we get into this automatic thought process, is where I'm up material, I'll just go into the endgame. Where we need to look at the position as a whole, where we realize, holy cow, this is a great position. Maybe it's worth more than a pawn. Maybe I can win even more. If we win a second pawn, win an exchange, or we checkmate the king, obviously the game's going to be much easier. And so this is a position where I would not go into the endgame. However, we did go into the endgame, so let's see what happens. White plays queen b5. And so then after take, things still look fine. And if, unfortunately, black has this one move, the rook e8 check, and we're forced to go here. And this is going to really highlight the nature of the endgame. I'm just going to back up for a quick second, is that, in my view, there's really two types of endgames, if you will, or there's two distinct phases. There's the early endgame, and there's the late endgame. The early endgame is basically this. Pieces have been exchanged. The queens in particular have been exchanged, but there's still quite a few pieces. You're not going to find this position in any book. It's not a theoretical position. It's messy. And then the late endgame would be, in general, there's only one piece left, right? It's a bishop against knight, or it's a rook endgame, right? And that's when we get closer to the theoretical position. So we got, in my view, there's the early and there's the late. The late endgame has some very specific rules, rooks belong behind passed pawns, etc., all of that. The early endgame's a bit different. And really, all that's about is two things: pawn structure and piece activity. In a perfect world, your pawns are all healthy, and all your pieces are doing something. And that's so important, because again, we only have 3 pieces. Black only has 3 pieces. And if one of them is bad, then that means, 33% of our forces is bad, right? Conversely, if we have 3 good pieces and our opponent has only 2, that's a 33%, advantage. That's huge. Absolutely huge. In this position, we can see this rook is terrible. And that's what's stopping it from being good, or an easy win, or just, an advantageous position. In fact, it makes the position dead equal. Just because this rook can't get into the game. And although it's black's rook, now that he's not so worried about his king, it can slide in over here. We got something like this can happen. And black can actually coordinate his forces fairly quickly, which makes up for the pawn deficit. So it's this move right here. If black didn't have rook e8, going to the endgame would probably be a decent idea. The second problem is that, okay, so black played rook c8. What he should have done is he should have just played rook b8 right away. And we got this x-ray down here, and then, if we try and defend the knight, doesn't matter. Okay, win the pawn. We're going to have a position like this. And we can see this is actually exasperating the difference in activity. Is that now black has a rook here on the second rank, which are notoriously good, right? A rook here is worth a pawn. And this rook is still bad. This knight's on the rim. Now it's true, okay, take the pawn. We can bring the knight back in here. And this position, at first glance, again, it looks good. Or it looks like this is something white should consider, right? You're up a pawn. It's a passed a pawn, outside passed pawn. What's not to like? And the unfortunate part is that, again, this is still a fairly early endgame, is that black's pieces are able to coordinate and get activity so quick. So if we look at rook h6, so now the rook can come over to the pawn, or it can harass the knight, or it can do, something like this, and all of a sudden we got double rooks on the 7th, which is absolutely fantastic. And white isn't quite in time to do it. For example, if we look at a sample variation, maybe we do the same thing. h4, trying to get our own rook in, like this. That's a possibility. If we look at something like this, bishop f4, the knight moves, the bishop retreats because it was attacked, put the rook behind the pawn, and then rook e6. And here we see the real problem, is that we would love to just push this pawn all the way up. But after something like this, the rook's going to come down. Obviously, we're pressuring f2 at this point, but also we can just slide the rook over here, interfering with the rook, the pawn's going to fall, and we're done. It's true, white's up a pawn, but black's activity with his pieces is so much stronger. White is simply uncoordinated. He's essentially playing down a rook, and it makes sense that he's not going to be able to keep a pawn after that. If you're down a rook, it's hard to keep all your pawns. And if you look at this position in the computer, I think it says it's perfectly equal, like 0.00. There's nothing there. Why did this happen? Because black's pieces were so active. And yes, white was able to keep his extra pawn, all the way until here, but it's not going to matter. And so what happened here is now black starts wasting tempo. This is one reason, just, for the record, is I dislike playing against computers when they're set on an artificially low setting. I think it was set at 2,000 rating. And what happens is the computers that don't play 2,000 level, they just start playing silly moves sometimes. Like here it plays rook c8, then you play g3, then it plays h4, and then only now does it play perhaps the most natural move, rook b8. Anyway, let's back up. So the computer plays rook c8. All right, so white just got a lifeline. All right, he didn't play rook b8. He's not invading down the b file. His rook is staying passive. So what do we do? Now in the game, white played g3, which makes a lot of sense, right? He wants to bring his king to g2, gets his rook over, and all of a sudden his rook's in the game, and things are a lot better. He's still up. Unfortunately, though, is that it's slow, and by playing g3, that again gives the option of rook b8, and then it's essentially the exact same variations we're just looking at. He's going to invade, his rook comes down to the second rank, there's not much we can do about it. So if we know that rook b8's the threat, what should we do? b3. So that way when he plays it, we can move, and then there's no danger on the b file. If you watch Simon Williams, the Ginger GM, he does absolutely fantastic analysis. Check him out if you haven't. And one thing that he constantly talks about is restraining and improving. Is that we want to be able to, we want to restrain our opponent's activity, and that's so important in the endgame. in these slower positions. There's not going to be a checkmate in this position. There's no sacrificial attacks. And so what we do is we want to find out what our opponent wants to do and then stop it. Because again, we are up a pawn. And if we can stop all of our opponent's ideas and then he has nothing he can do, that greatly increases the chance that our pawn can decide the game. And so by playing b3, we would have safeguarded that, and we would have a much easier time. And also notice that this really highlights the weakness in Black's pawn structure. These pawns, they obviously can't protect each other, while these three make a fantastic wedge. And as they're on light squares, it means the Black bishop can't defend it or attack it at all. The Black bishop can fly all around, but he can't actually influence those pawns, which would be nice. The computer, anyway, so b3, that would have been the right idea. G3 makes sense. Again, but Rook b8 would happen. The computer doesn't play Rook b8. It plays h4. And this would be another chance where we could have played b3. Because do we really care if Black takes? I mean, sure, his Rook's on an open file, but we're going to play King g2 anyway. Everything's defended. Rook's going to slide over. The pawns aren't really any weaker than before. When we play g4 in the game, that gives time for Black to play Rook b8, and then the unhappiness happens on the b file. And we'll see that. We try and defend it with the Rook. The bishop moves back. Knight c3. Rook takes the pawn. So let's back up. Let's look at this here. So it's well known that we want to, when you're up material, we want to trade pieces and not pawns. In this position here, though, if we just move our knight back and then Black takes, it's not so much a pawn trade as it is a pawn loss. All of a sudden, material is equal again. And so the most critical move in this position, even though it's a pawn trade, has to be knight takes c7. So that way, after take here, we're still technically up a pawn for right now. But the most important thing, and the computer really highlights this with a really nice variation, is that we can get our pieces active very quickly. And this is with the move King g2, Rook takes c2, Rook b1, which is incredible. And now we see, well, look, this knight is active, this Rook is active, this Rook is active. And if we do something like this, all of a sudden, oh, we realize Black has huge back rank problems, and White is simply winning. So we back up. In this position, White's activity now has absolutely skyrocketed. It's true, we've sacrificed a pawn, but we were up a pawn to start, and so material is equal, but our activity is much higher. And again, this is the most important thing. The two most important things are pawn structure, piece activity in the early endgame. And what does Black do? All right, so it looks like, again, the threat is Rook b8 on the back rank. It looks like something like g6 would be what Black would want to do. And then after Rook d7, in fact, the most natural move, Rook to me at least, Bishop f6, the computer says just completely loses after check, the lovely Knight e6 check, Rook f7. And do we see how the piece activity now, I mean, Bishop obviously can't come back, we do this, we got g5 coming. Black is completely crushed. And this is almost like a middle game-ish attack, right, against Black's king. What happened? Because our activity was so high. It was all about that activity. So that is really the main thing we want to think about, is keep our pawns safe as much as we can and get our pieces active. By playing knight c3, that's sort of keeping our pawns safe. The knight is protecting the a pawn after Rook takes b2, but it's not getting us active as much as the other variation did, right? Plus material is equal. Anyway, after Rook b5, with the same idea, it looks like if Black tries to take the pawn, then we've got this, and Black just loses. The computer plays a silly move, Rook b4, which gives us a tempo to play King g2. Now our Rook can slide over again. Take, take. We're getting closer. Black plays g5. And then what do? Knight takes a7. Excellent. So we won our pawn again. That's great. For some reason, the computer likes knight takes c7 a lot more. And I tried to look into this position, and I didn't really figure that out. I don't see a huge difference between knight takes and the other one. I'm thinking the best I can guess is that from here, the knight is able to come to d5 or, another square somewhere. Whoops, I can't delete arrows very well. I'm really good at this. Whereas when it takes on a7, it has less opportunity. It can't come to d5. The best it can do is c6. I'm not sure. But the computer really likes knight takes c7 more. Anyway, we have rook h6, knight retreats, here. There's one, I want to kind of skip ahead a little bit. Right here. Okay. So if we look at this, the knight lands on a great square, d6. And now at this point, we're going to exit the endgame stage, or the early endgame, and it becomes strictly a late endgame, as I would call it, after take. And so this is a pure rook endgame at this point. And in his excellent book, G.M. Mihail Meron, if I'm saying his name correctly, he had, I believe it's Learn from the Legends. It came out several years ago. It deals with practical endgames, and it talks about rook endgames, and he says something really profound, I think, is that when it comes to rook endgames, there's three factors. There's obviously material, being up pawns, there's rook activity, and there's king activity. And he says you need at least two of those to win most rook positions. If you only have one, it's not enough. So if you're only up one pawn, but kings are equal and the rooks are equal, that's usually not enough. There'd have to be something really special in the position. Right? If you're up two pawns, yes, that's enough. If you're up a pawn and your rook is really active compared to the opponent's, then that is often enough. But if you only have one, it isn't. And if you look at this position, we play rook a1, rook belongs behind the passed pawn, rook a4, and we can see, yes, we have an extra pawn, but his rook is much better than ours. And we can actually see that after a3, we'll just pause it here for a second. If we look at black's rook, we can see how active it is. Obviously, it's stopping this pawn, so the pawn can't move. But it's also completely stopping the white king from advancing past here. And if you look at the white rook, it's stuck guarding this pawn, and it has two squares of influence, where it can't move away, otherwise it's going to lose the pawn. And the black rook has all of this. And so the black rook is much more active. It's restricting the pawn, which is restricting the rook, and it's inadvertently restricting the king. So the king, it would love, to come over here to do something like this, but it can't. And so in this position, should be a draw. Played correctly from here. And we can actually see that. White tries, and white tries hard, but it's very difficult to actually do anything in this position. And even though both kings are far away, so they come in close. And now there's actually something interesting as well, is that this isn't necessarily a threat in this position, but because black's rook is active, there's always the annoying idea of coming here, which might attack this pawn, but also check, and then winning this pawn. And now black would have a protected passed h-pawn that's 3 moves away from queening. Now black has to be very careful if we do this, because again, this pawn could start going. But that could be an annoying threat, especially if this king can blockade the pawn. And that's only possible because the rook is so active, right? And this rook can't really do anything. This rook is forced to just sit here and grovel. And now white, I think, starts trying really hard to win the game, because he's up a pawn, so he should be thinking about winning the game, of course. But if you think about Meron's analysis, or Meron's idea of rook endgames, it's just not possible. We play c4. I'm assuming that's to stop king b5 at any point. So we got c4, king here. And now I'm sure we can't play king c3, because that just loses the pawn, and then the rook comes right back. And now this is obviously dead drawn. But in the game, we played, king d2. which I think is even worse, just getting up a pawn. I think at this point, after king c5, is where we just sort of accept the draw. We play, rook a2, black does something. If black takes the pawn, that might give us an opportunity to push the pawn. And if black just sort of, sits here, does whatever, what else does black do? Okay, take the pawn. Best idea, I think. By playing king d2, okay, computer plays a funny move, rook d4, then f3, f6, and now our king moves away again. If this, and now all of a sudden, it's black who's playing for a win. Why? Material's equal. Rook, much more active. King, is it more active? I think it is, because black has a passed pawn, right? Oh, I'm really good at these arrows, sorry. That wants to come here, and we can see the black king, right, is already controlling several of these squares. If this black king can come, somewhere like this, where now it's controlling the queening square, it's also threatening this pawn, black has winning opportunities here. It's probably still a draw, but I'd rather be black. Just like that. What happens instead, though, is black takes with the rook. And we can see how this immediately changes everything. Because material is equal, but after a4, okay, and then a5, and then, okay, we got some moves here, a6, we can see how the position has just completely changed. Now it's the white rook. Let's see if I can actually draw. Has all of this here. Well, the black rook is stuck with only 2. If the black rook tries to move around, black rook comes over here, well, the pawn's just going to advance all the way. Huge increase. Now the rook can come to check. Now this rook can come over here and attack the pawn. And this was the decisive mistake from black. Even though material, well, maybe not. But yeah, almost certainly, I think. The computer, what does the computer say? The computer says, gotta be careful with computers with endgame, sometimes that can be finicky, is that when the computer played rook e7 check, and then over here, now it says the position is almost certainly lost for black. And we can see that, is that this rook is terrible. Kings are pretty much the same. Black has to retreat. And we have the outside passed pawn, which is perhaps the most classic winning idea in an endgame, is that black has to spend time to corral that pawn. And after that happens, though, is that white uses the time to win all these pawns over here, which is a fantastic trade. And we'll see that exactly. This part of the endgame is actually played fairly well by our hero here from white. We just retreat, which is fine. We're waiting for black to make a move. We're able to check him away. We win a pawn, just like that. So now we're up a pawn. We've got the better rook, and our king is probably more active because we're going to come over here. And he's got the opposition for now, but it's his turn to move, right? And so black goes for the pawn. Sacrifice, sacrifice, boom. And then this is an easy win from here. We just take all the pawns. I think we actually queen 2 of them. I mean, if you're going to queen some pawns, might as well get them all, right? Definitely. So as a recap, what I want to... 3 main things. Is if we start... Let's see, where is it? No, even further. It's what, move 17? Yes, right here. In this position, maybe just ignore the arrows, is that we have the option of going into the endgame with queen b5, but it's not the best option. This would be a great middle game position. So just because we're up a pawn doesn't mean we should automatically go into the endgame. We might have something better, right? And castling, where we're going to play rook e1, we've got knight d5, queen d7, we got all sorts of things. What does black do? Black doesn't have, obvious moves. It's much easier to play white here, even against the computer, which keeps playing funny moves. This would be excellent, right? So, yeah, so that's the first thing. Just because you have pawns doesn't mean you need to go into the endgame. However, we did go into the endgame. So what do we need to think about? In the early endgame, the most important thing is piece activity. And the reason this endgame was hard, well, for 2 reasons. One is that black had rook b8. and then invasion down here. So his rook became very active, and he won his pawn back. But the real problem was this rook e8, which forced our rook over here. And it took a very long time for this rook to come into the game. It was like 10, 15 moves from here. And then it was a pure rook endgame. Whereas black, it's very easy for his rooks to do things. So even though he's down a pawn, his activity is better, it's about equal. And the game continuation really showed that. There are a couple of options in which we could have played b3 earlier. When black had played h4 or black had played rook c8, we could have played b3 to stop our opponent. That's a really important idea, because in the endgame, there's fewer pieces, there's fewer plans to do, and it's possible, if you have the better position, to actually fully stop that. Again, this is a big idea that Simon Williams says again and again and again. If you look at some of his videos, especially, he has some long play games where he plays 15 minutes time limit against other players, and he really explains his moves. Some of them go into the end game, and I don't know if Simon Williams isn't known as a great end game player, but he's a grandmaster, and he often makes it look really, really easy, even in pretty equal positions. And that's what he comes back to again and again. Stop your opponent's ideas, restrain them, because if he has no active plans, then you can just improve and you're going to win, or at the very least, you'll be very comfortable. And then finally, we get into this endgame. I know I skipped over a couple of moves here in the middle. Let's go right here. And where there's rook endgames are the most common pure endgames, or these late endgames, as I've been calling them. And it's three things. This is Jean-Michel Morin's idea. Again, his book, Learn from the Legends, I believe is what it's called, or Lessons from the Legends. It was the chess book of the year several years ago. It's absolutely fantastic. There's like 4 editions now. Anyway, and his idea in rook endgames is there's 3 factors. Pawns being up material, king, relative king activity, and relative rook activity. And you need at least 2 of them. So this also tells us that if we have at least 2 of those things, rook endgames are very, very good for us. We should pursue them. And it also tells us, whoops, I should have deleted that. It also tells us that if we don't have them, we should try and perhaps not go into such an endgame. And here, that really shows. And the computer had to do some pretty silly things here. Not take the pawn at the king, not take the pawn at the king, take the pawn with the rook, right? And allow your pawn to absolutely fly. And only then did it allow the standard outside pass pawn winning activity, or winning technique to come in, which you did very well. You forced black to go over, and then you were able to gobble up all the pawns over there. So that's that. I kept this under half an hour, so that makes me happy. I was hoping it'd be a bit less than that, but I like to talk. I'm sorry. Hopefully you found that helpful. Hope you found that useful. Excuse me. There's that. If you have questions about this, feel free. I'd love to ask. Again, I'm not a super endgame player. Perhaps there are some of these, there were little nuances and techniques we could have used to improve, but I think that overall thought process, that those guidelines can be really, really useful, something to think about. Okay, so again, I'm SmithyQ, SmithyQ.com. Like, subscribe if you want to do that. That'd be great. All these messages, that's fantastic. I've got another video coming out tomorrow. And that's that. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.